world, there is a branch of that religion that is Gnostic or Jnanic or whatever you want to call it, that focuses on some higher and very difficult to describe truth that may even be beyond words, and this is the focus of it. In the Vedic literature specifically, this Jnanic school is a school of studying things in a very detailed way. There are 6 darshans, which I won't get into in detail, but there's the original idea of what's called Nyaya or logic, which was first described by Gautam Rishi, and he wrote some literature about it, and it describes the art of thinking clearly and forming logical conclusions, asking questions in a cogent way. This is what the Greeks were all about, and I'm sure they borrowed it from, in large part, from this older school that had been in existence for a long time by Gautam Rishi, the Jnana school. Then after him we have Kanada, who talked about atomic theory. That was his concept. He talked about everything comes from matter. He described things in a very mystical way. He did not actually describe God, but he was a type of Jnanic school. And then beyond him, we have someone called Kapila. There was an original Kapila who was an incarnation of Supreme Lord, but there's a much later Kapila who also described a system called Sankhya, which was mostly atheistic. And so he describes yet a third kind of jnana. And so when we talk about jnana, specifically from India, this is what we're talking about, a mixture of these groups. The Nyaya school, the atomic school or Vaisheshika school, the school of Sankhya. And people oftentimes discuss these ideas with one another, and they argue about what's right and what's wrong, what the Vedas really say. But this is all within the school of Jnana, or it's sometimes called Jnana Yoga. And the goal of that school is usually to merge with the All One. That's the basic stated goal of the Jnana school. And Bhakti Yoga is very different than that. We don't accept either that process, nor do we accept that as a goal. Does that make sense to answer your question? I'm sorry I had to get a little technical there, but sometimes there's no other way unless you're going to not make it so clear. Any other questions about, yes?
Just, you sparked something in my mind that was buried. Which incarnation of Kapila, his mother was Devahuti? Which one is that, though?
That's the original Kapila, Devahuti and Kardam Muni.
Okay.
So they lived back in Swayambhuva Manu, which is billions of years ago. That was way back there. And then we have the atheist Kapila, who as far as I know wasn't married, and he's in the, I think, 14th, 15th century or somewhere like that. It's a very different person. He has the same name, and unfortunately many historians have fused the two together, and because they both spoke on a system called Sankhya, most people scarce make any differentiation between them, but their philosophy is very different, and they're not the same person at all.
Well, the book I have, haven't opened in years, was Teachings of Lord Kapila by Srila Prabhupada's book.
Right. So that's the Devahuti.
But that was way.
Right. And ancient.
Yeah. Back in the day.
Yeah. So that's a very different Kapila. I thought I saw another hand go up here. So yeah.
Would you say that all other forms of yoga, besides bhakti, are more oriented towards the impersonal?
Generally, that's correct. Technically speaking, what we usually talk about when we're talking about yoga, and we're talking about these different strands, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, Ashtanga yoga, and karma, and which one didn't I say? Jnana yoga. Those have different goals. Usually, karma yoga, the goal is the heavenly worlds. For Jnana Yoga, the goal is to merge with the Supreme. For Ashtanga Yoga, the goal is to actually, at least the original stated goal of Ashtanga Yoga is to meditate upon the Supreme within the heart chakra, to come face to face with the Lord in the heart. But these days, that's not the goal of yoga. Usually the goal of yoga these days is either health, or if you want to go beyond that, when we talk about Ashtanga Yoga or the physical posture yoga, the usual goal of it is mystic powers, which are called siddhis. So many times people engage in the practice of Ashtanga Yoga to gain various mystic powers, which are described in Bhagavatam as being the real danger in yoga. That if one performs it correctly and is able somehow to be austere enough to do it for a long period of time, one will actually get mystic powers. And with mystic powers comes an inflated sense of ego, and then we become magicians, amazing our friends and relatives, and we lose our lives instead of searching for God in some kind of mystic pursuit of being able to do something amazing before people. Does that answer your question? I tried to. But mostly Jnana Yoga, the goal is the impersonal. That's their stated goal. Yeah, you have a question back. Yeah.
Talking about yoga, could you talk about a little bit about Kundalini yoga?
Kundalini Yoga.
Yes.
Yeah, that's also somewhat a side branch of the Ashtanga Yoga system. So Ashtanga Yoga system, we said a minute ago, is these 8 steps. And these 8 steps actually, when you start getting into dharana, dhyana, and this meditational aspect of it, we learn about the 6 chakras, and sometimes that's called Sat Chakra Yoga. There's 6 chakras in the body, and that yoga is supposed to gradually get you to visit the chakras one after another. And after you've visited them all, you wind up coming back down to the heart chakra where the Supreme Lord is residing, not just in you and not just in humans, but in every being. The Supreme Lord resides in the heart chakra. Every form of life has a chakra system, and the Supreme Being is there. The Kundalini system is actually a way of moving energy up and down the spine, and is supposed to give one an out-of-the-body experience, or to actualize someone's higher awareness. But it's actually a very dangerous system. We don't recommend anybody to get involved with Kundalini Yoga, because either you won't get anything out of it, which is probably the best thing that could happen, or worse, you could permanently derange yourself, because these energies that shoot up and down the spine are not to be trifled with, and oftentimes people move the Kundalini in such a way that it disturbs their mental balance for the rest of their lives, So I don't know too much more about it. I know that it's kind of a tangent of the Ashtanga Yoga system, but that's about as much as I can say about it. Now, getting back to what we're describing here, discussing here, the 6th chapter has the first 5 or 4 verses basically talking about beginning yoga. This is called the Yoga Rurukshu stage. And then there's the next 5 verses from about 5 to 9, which describe the higher stages, or the Yoga Rudha stage, where one doesn't engage in any activity. Of course, just having described this system of various kinds of yoga, that much we've already talked about. Then starting with verse 10 all the way up to 32, we're in 17 today, starting with verse 10, Krishna takes us through various aspects of the meditational yoga process. He talks about various things in the meditational yoga process. And by talking about various things in the meditational yoga process, he makes us aware of meditational yoga. And he foreshadowed chapter 6 back in chapter 5. There was a verse, I think 527. Yeah. 527, 528. Sparshan kritva bahir bahyams chakshush chaivantare ruvoho prana panao samo kritva nasha bhyantara charanao yatindriya manobudhir mudhir moksha parayana vigatechcha bhayakroho yasadamukta evasa. Shutting out all the external sense objects, keeping the eyes and vision concentrated between the two eyebrows, suspending the inward and outward breath within the nostrils, and thus controlling the mind, senses, and intelligence, the transcendentalist, aiming at liberation, becomes free from desire, fear, and anger. One who is always in this state is certainly liberated. So Krishna doesn't talk anything more about the yoga system in chapter 5. But in chapter 6, he begins to elaborate on the yoga system, the meditational or the Ashtanga yoga system, the physical yoga system. Now, let me ask the question, why does Krishna describe the yoga system to Arjuna, this meditational physical yoga system? Why do you suppose he does that? We've talked about some reasons it might be there, but there's a number of them. Yeah.
Well, so he has the background, so he just has more of an understanding, because everything is so gradual. You have to fill in all the information, fill in the blanks, so he can make a choice.
Yeah. That's one of the more important reasons, that he's giving Arjuna all the background, and as we were saying before too, he explains all these different systems, so when he finally gets around to explaining the system he really wants Arjuna to do, it's clear that this is what he really wants, and he's already talked about the others. But later on, we'll also see how the yoga system does fit into the bhakti yoga system. But there's one more reason why I'm hoping that maybe somebody will grasp.
Yes, sir.
Was that?
Yes, sir. Well, he was quite upset
Uh-huh.
about what Krishna wanted him to do. So maybe to calm him, to help him to quiet his mind.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's actually closer than, it's almost there. There's something else that I'm trying to get a little bit more, a little bit further into the early part of the Bhagavad Gita. But that's certainly there, that he's trying to calm Arjuna down. And along that same line, maybe somebody has something else they could think of. I'm just going to see if anybody can figure it out.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, the question is, why is Krishna bothering with this yoga system, explaining it to Arjuna? Why does he explain it in chapter 6? Yeah.
I think the whole Bhagavad Gita, there are many yogas.
Yeah.
So Krishna want to convey all yogas to the world.
Yeah.
So that what is appropriate for all of us, we follow that.
Right.
Some people are oriented toward bhakti. Some people may not be. So
Yeah.
they go to chapter 6 for
Yeah.
Dhyana Yoga. So Krishna wanted to cover everybody, different paths of following the truth.
Okay, that's another possibility. I think that's also valid.
Maybe just to continue in this same vein of learning to control your senses, so that he has more of the ability to, Arjuna, to control his mind, because there somewhere it says it's like trying to control the wind. You can't.
Yeah,
but
that
yet-
happens in a few verses. That's
Right, but yet if he has that ability to at least start that process, he won't be so shocked like when Krishna shows him his universal form or whatever. But I mean, to prepare him for this battle ahead of Kurukshetra, maybe, because he has
Yeah.
to kill all his relatives, and So he won't be so shocked, I'm guessing.
Yeah, those things are there. One of the things that comes to my mind is if you go back to chapter 1, Arjuna is suggesting that he not fight. I mean, that's the whole reason the Bhagavad Gita is spoken, because there's this monumental battle about to start. And Arjuna has suddenly come to the full realization that he's about to kill not strangers, but people he's known all his life that are on the other side of the battle. And that strikes Arjuna very sour. He's not ready to do that. And he goes so far, even in chapter 1, of suggesting that he's not going to fight. And he says that better that I live by begging. So to live by begging, Arjuna is actually kind of suggesting that he perform yoga. That's what he would be doing. Arjuna is a kshatriya, and as a kshatriya, his life has been law enforcement, basically. That's what he's been involved with, or being a career military, how we use it in modern terms. So that's what his life is. And for him to suddenly suggest that he's going to beg suggests that he also imagines that he's going to be a meditator. And so here Krishna is describing in the 6th chapter the whole process of meditation to tell Arjuna, if this is what you're thinking you will do instead of fight, let me give you a clear picture of what that would look like. And we know, although we're just in verse 17, but later on in about verse 33, then suddenly Arjuna comes to full grips with what he was kind of suggesting in chapter 1, that he not fight, that he become a beggar, meaning that he become a mendicant, live in the forest and meditate. Because if you're going to live in the forest, that's what you do. You're not going to become a trapper. He's going to become a meditator in the forest. And for him to meditate, now Krishna's explaining chapter 6. This is what it would look like, Arjuna, if you say you want to be a meditator. This is what your life would look like. And he describes these things. And we're about halfway through them, because we go all the way from verse 10 all the way up to about verse 32. And Krishna's describing various elements of this meditational yoga process. And then at the very end of it, Arjuna caps the whole thing off with saying, gee, I don't think I can do that. The process you have described seems unendurable and impossible to me, for the mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very difficult to control. And to control it is like trying to control the raging wind. So this is Arjuna's soliloquy at the end of hearing this whole explanation. And this is exactly what Krishna knew would happen. And this is what Krishna thought Arjuna would react to by hearing this yoga that he's offering that he would do in place of the battle. This is how Krishna's explaining, okay, you want to do this yoga, this is what it would look like. So that's another reason. I think these other reasons that you all have given are good too, but that's one of the reasons I think of for why Krishna spent the 6th chapter talking about yoga. He hinted at it in the 5th chapter, and now in the 6th chapter he's giving us all these details. How one sits on a kusha grass with one's eyes staring at the tip of the nose, half closed. The idea, of course, is that if your eyes are full closed, there's every chance of just nodding out. If your eyes are fully open, you're going to be distracted by things, so you've got to have just half closed eyes and stare at the tip of the nose. And so we find out all these kind of mechanistic and technical details of yoga. And last week, you all came to this verse. That there's no possibility of one's becoming a yogi, or Arjuna, if one eats too much, eats too little, sleeps too much, or does not sleep enough. So here Krishna is kind of advocating a middle path about things, Yogis are not supposed to be austere to the point where they never sleep, nor should they oversleep. Neither should they starve themselves, neither should they eat too much. And today's verse, Yukta hara viharasya, yukta chetasya karmasu, yukta swapno vabodhasya, yogo bhavati dukkha. He who is regulated in his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practicing the yoga system. So we can regulate our habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work. And of course, really, Krishna is speaking here about yoga as it's relating to bhakti yoga. You know, this yoga of meditation has its parallel in bhakti yoga. And sometimes in this verse, in these verses of chapter 6, Krishna is speaking specifically about the yoga process, the eightfold yoga process where one performs hatha and then meditates. And sometimes he's speaking about the devotional aspect of yoga, how a bhakti yoga performs yoga, because bhakti yoga is also a kind of yoga. So what's interesting here is that for the most part, Krishna cannot really be talking about the meditational yoga process here, because technically a meditational yoga isn't eating much of anything. He's in trance for maybe even months or years on end. So what's he eating during that time? Nothing. Is he sleeping? He's not sleeping either. He's not. What kind of recreation is he doing in a yoga trance? He's not doing any kind of recreation. This is the bhakti yoga system seen through the eyes of the yoga system, the Ashtanga yoga system. So Krishna here is speaking about really the bhakti yoga system. And if we're going to be bhakti yogis, we learn that we control our senses by regulating them. We don't splurge on the one side, nor on the other side do we pull in the belt to the point where we have no food, we have nothing to sleep on, we don't sleep at all. We're not trying to drive the senses crazy either. So this is the right kind of concept for the bhakti yogi. He's not either trying to pander the senses, nor is he trying to ignore the senses altogether to the point where they're screaming for satisfaction. And this actually makes sense. We are not trying to chop off our senses. We are simply just trying to redirect them, which is one of the themes of the whole first 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita. Over and over again, Arjuna has asked the question, do you want me to work, or do you want me just to have knowledge? And Krishna keeps saying again and again that I want you to work, and that is knowledge, and that you're not supposed to give up your work, you're supposed to give up the fruit of your work. That's different than giving up work. And so this process of regulating the senses is how one, as a bhakti yogi, one gains control of the senses by learning how to regulate them. Anybody have questions with that? I'll let it sink in for a minute. Of course, in the purport, Prabhupada gives us some indication of people who were very extreme, and we do see that, like the 6 Goswamis, who basically didn't even hardly sleep 1 or 2 hours a day, and they ate basically nothing. But this is not what we should do in the stage of sadhana bhakti, or in the stage of beginning bhakti. If we come to the stage where we are so full of devotional service and we're so lost in our connection with the Supreme Lord, we don't remember to sleep, we don't remember to eat, that's a whole other thing. But most of us aren't at that stage, so we shouldn't artificially mimic it. In fact, it'll push us the wrong way if we try. So rather than that, we should do what Krishna is recommending here. Not eat too much, not eat too little, not sleep too much, not sleep enough, and regulating our sensory activities. And by regulating too, we learn to redirect our senses. We redirect them from things which bring us into the wrong direction, away from spiritual life, and we redirect them towards bringing them towards spiritual life. And that, in a very simple way, is a description of Bhakti Yoga. We learn how to redirect our senses. And in the beginning, it's somewhat artificial. In the beginning, it's hard. But the longer you do it, and if you're associating with people who are doing it for the right reasons, with the right mentality, you will find that very quickly it becomes not an artificial thing, but it becomes a genuine thing. And we become genuinely disinterested in the material world and the things that it glitters and offers us. These things are there, and at one time they had a strong magnetic pull on our heart and our consciousness, but now those things no longer attract us the same way they once did. And it happens gradually, and it happens naturally by the process of Bhakti Yoga, by learning to redirect the senses over and over again, day by day. And in the beginning, we don't do so well. Our report card isn't so great. But the longer we keep up, the longer we stick with it, we find that we make more and more progress. It becomes easier and easier. And this is actually how a person becomes a true lover of God. In the beginning, we do it because we know we should. We do it because we know the system. But towards the latter stages of it, we genuinely feel a connection with God. And we do it because we honestly want to, and we're honestly not interested in the alternatives. Any questions there? Yes.
What would you say is too little sleep or too much sleep?
Too much sleep, yeah. That's a good question.
Like, could you quantify it?
Well, Prabhupada actually gives you figures. He says 5 or 6 hours a night. And, he talks like that. I wish I could follow that. I'm struggling with that. But that's what we find is that when someone becomes very, very focused in spiritual life, they need to sleep less and less, generally, unless they have health issues. Sometimes that doesn't work so well if that's there. But basically, the more one becomes alive inside, the more that consciousness kind of pervades and pushes the body past certain normal limitations the body would have. And that's why we don't recommend people to artificially try to push the body in this way. But if it starts to happen naturally as a result of one's inner connection and one's inner taste developing, then that's another thing. So Prabhupada says generally a person should sleep about 5 or 6 hours a day, and a night rather. And I guess that's about all I can say about that. I think that's what you were asking, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions about this? Yeah.
Yeah, doesn't he even specifies 10 get up at 4 in the morning?
Yeah, right. So there's times of the day that are better. We know that there are 3 modes of nature. You won't read about them here, but you'll encounter them in chapter 14 later on. There's goodness, passion, and ignorance. And so the early part of the day, which is called the Brahma Muhurta hour, which is just before sunrise to just before noon, that's called the Brahma Muhurta. That's the best time of day. That's the time of day when the modes are the purest. Then from about noon to afternoon, during that time, that's the mode of passion. And that's usually when everybody works and when we're knocking things out and people are bumping around, getting places in their cars, in the taxis, in the subways, and, punching the time clock and doing their stuff. Then mode of goodness from noon to about 8 o'clock is the mode of passion. From 8 to 4 in the morning is the mode of ignorance. So the world naturally works that way. Nobody designed it that way, but that's the way it's designed by the Supreme to work. So naturally, if you can be awake, be conscious, and be engaged in spiritual activity during the early part of the day, that's the best. Any other questions about this particular thing? If not, we'll rock it on down into the next verse. Because chittam atmani eva vatishtate nishpriha sarva karme yo yukta iti uchate tada. When the yogi, by practice of yoga, disciplines his mental activities and becomes situated in transcendence, devoid of all material desires, he is said to be well established in yoga. So when the yogi, by practice of yoga, disciplines his mental activities and becomes situated in transcendence, devoid of all material desires, he is said to be well established in yoga. So one of the themes of this chapter, of chapter 6, is different kinds of yoga. One of the themes is different stages of yoga. Particularly, we heard about this Yoga Rukshu stage, which is the beginning stage, and the Yoga Rudha stage, which is the higher stages. This has a parallel in Bhakti Yoga. We hear about the earlier stages of Bhakti Yoga, where one is engaged in what's called sadhana bhakti, or we're following Bhakti Yoga in the sense that we're following rules and regulations. Then the latter stage of Bhakti Yoga is following Bhakti, but the stage of spontaneous feeling. That's a very different thing. In the beginning, we know what we're doing, and we're trying to make the body follow the activities and ways that it should go as a result of our knowing what's best. But later on, our natural love for God awakens, and it's no longer an external show. It's actually a spontaneous outpouring of our love for God into our everyday activities, into our everyday life. And so that's the difference between the early stages of Bhakti Yoga and the latter stages of Bhakti Yoga. And in this purport of 6.18, Prabhupada quotes this very long verse about Maharaj Pariksit. Not Maharaj Pariksit, Maharaj Ambarish, that's what I'm trying to say. Maharaj Ambarish. And it quotes a very sort of practical way that one can engage in Bhakti Yoga in everyday life. You know, it says that, I'll read it here. King Ambarish first engaged his mind on the lotus feet of the Lord Krishna. Then, one after another, he engaged his words in describing the transcendental qualities of the Lord. So we engage the mind in thinking about Krishna. We engage our words in describing the qualities of the Lord. His hands in mopping the temple of the Lord. His ears in hearing the activities of the Lord. His eyes in seeing the transcendental forms of the Lord. His body in touching the bodies of the devotees. His sense of smell in smelling the scents of the lotus flowers offered to the Lord. His tongue in tasting the tulsi leaf offered at the lotus feet of the Lord. His legs in going to places of pilgrimage and the temple of the Lord. His head in offering obeisances unto the Lord. His desires in executing the mission of the Lord. All these transcendental activities are quite befitting a pure devotee. So there's a very simple, not hard to understand at all, and practical description of Bhakti Yoga. Now we're not talking philosophical anymore. We're talking about how Maharaj Ambarish actually did it. And this is the way he did it. He thought about the Supreme Lord, he spoke about the Supreme Lord, he heard about the Supreme Lord, he embraced the bodies of the devotees, he mopped the temple of the Lord, he engaged in all these different activities. And in fact, we see the process of devotional service is like this. We learn how to moment go from one type of meditation on the Supreme to another type of meditation on the Supreme. There are 9 processes of devotional service. Does anybody know what they are here? Hearing is one.
Siva,
What's that?
Siva, S-E-V-A.
Activity.
Seva.
Yeah, seva. Yeah,
Seva.
that's actually number 4, I think.
Chanting.
Japa, chanting, yeah, so hearing and chanting. Shravanam, kirtanam, first is Shravanam is hearing. Kirtanam is chanting. Shravanam, kirtanam. Vishnu Smaranam, what does that mean in English?
Remembering Krishna.
Remembering Krishna, yeah, Vishnu Smaranam, that's third one. Vishnu Padasevanam, that's what you were saying, serving the lotus feet of the Lord, Vishnu. Padasevanam, serving the lotus feet, Vishnu or Padasevanam. Archanam, what is that? That's deity worship in the
Right,
temple,
that's
where
right.
you either worship the deity on the altar, if you're a pujari, or you're watching people worship the deity by your singing or your dancing or your offering some flower in the temple. That's Archanam. Vandanam is what? Some of you may know the Sanskrit, so that gives you a clue. What is that one? Vandanam is offering prayers. That's another type of service. Vandanam, Archanam, let's see. Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam. Dasyam is becoming a servant. Dasyam. Sakyam is becoming a friend to the Supreme Lord. And finally, Atmini Videna, who you're all missing today. Because he's in Croatia with his wife, Subi. But Atmini Vedam means actually giving up everything for the Lord. So these are the 9 processes. 1 is Shravanam, hearing. 2 is Kirtanam, chanting. Vishnu Smaranam is 3, or remembering the Lord. Padasevanam, offering service. Vandanam, offering prayers. Archanam, doing deity worship or offering on the altar. Then there's the 3 more mysterious ones, which is Dasyam, becoming a servant, Sakyam, becoming a friend, and Atmini Vinayam, giving up everything. So the practice of Krishna consciousness is just segueing from one of these things to another. And it's surprising, you can actually fill up a whole day with going from one of these things to another. And that's the whole trick of spiritual life. Yena tena prakarena mana Krishna niveshaya. Somehow or other, always think of Krishna. Sarva vidi niseda shur etayor evakinkra. All the rules and regulations in Scripture hang on these 2 principles. Somehow or other, always think of Krishna. It's said another way that, what is it? Smartavya satatam Vishnu, or Vismartavya na jatu shit. Vishmartavya na jatu chit, that's what I'm trying to say. Sarva vidi niseda shur etayor evakinkra. That always think of Krishna and never forget Krishna. The whole rules and regulations of Scripture hang on these 2 principles. So somehow or other, always think of Krishna. And so we're doing that in a very practical way. By hearing something about Krishna, by chanting Krishna's name in the holy name, either musically, as they do on Union Square up there, Ram Roy and our group up there, or you can do it without musical instruments on beads, which is called japa, or you can remember Krishna by opening a book and reading something about Krishna's pastimes or the philosophy, or you can tell somebody about Krishna, or you can hear somebody talk about Krishna, or you can learn how to cook for Krishna, you can learn how to engage people by having them get books, or come to a temple, or engage in some other process. These are all various ways we can remember Krishna. We can clean a temple, we can help people get a place ready for a program or clean up afterwards. We can help with organizing permits or all these other kind of things. These are all ways that our senses, our 5 knowledge acquiring senses and our 5 working senses, can be used to serve Krishna. And Krishna consciousness or bhakti yoga is simply just learning how to fill your life up with these different things in different ways. We're not always doing the same thing. Most of us couldn't do that. That's why meditation and yoga is not practical in this age, that we are too diversified and we are too antsy to be able just to sit in one place and do the same thing all the time. So therefore, this is actually not a disqualification in the age of Kali Yuga. We can use our senses in different ways and segue from one way to another. In this way, we can 24/7 be engaged in one type of service to the Supreme or another. Any questions about any of that? Yeah, I see a question in the back there.
You mentioned that, we're too antsy in this age to
Yeah.
sit for meditation, but yet japa can take, it's a discipline to be learned.
Yeah, certainly.
So I'm learning, but I can have the tendency to.
Well, if someone can chant and sit in one place, especially the yoga posture or the lotus posture, and chant all 16 rounds, and all my hats off to them. Ideally that's good. We certainly would encourage that. I can't do that. What I do is I usually walk, and I do that because I definitely don't want to go to sleep. I have a lot of health issues, so my sleeping and eating is kind of irregulated, and I know that if I sit down, there's a good chance snoozing off while I try to chant. So I usually walk, but it is better if you can sit down while you chant, but there's nothing that says you have to. So here's a meditation that can be performed while walking or while sitting. The japa doesn't require you to be in any kind of particular posture, but you shouldn't be in a slouchy posture. Maybe you've heard that tape where Prabhupada's chanting japa. He's going, Hare Krishna, Krishna, sit properly. He's telling one of his devotees to, because you shouldn't be kind of like, slouched over or kicked back or any of those kind of things. You should be in an attentive and in a kind of humble and respectful posture. But that's all that's required. You can be walking or you can be moving. You have a question?
Like I'm basically new. I'm just learning. I'm learning a lot through the literature, and I speak to Rama a lot in Union Square.
Good.
And I have an altar in my room, and the thing I'm trying, what is there any designated time where? What would be the best time just to pray? Can you pray anytime? You
can pray anytime, and in fact, you should try to pray as often as you can think about it. However, as we were saying a minute ago, the mornings are the best times. It's always the best time if you can carve a space in the morning. We do something called japa. Japa is chanting on beads, and we take a vow to chant a certain quantity every day. That's why we have beads. There's 108 on a string, and we use that to chalk out a certain quantity every day. And during the time when we're chanting, we are trying not to do anything else. We're trying just to hear the sound vibration of the holy name. And as simple as that sounds in words, I know all of you who are doing it know that sounds simple. Doing it ain't simple at all, because our mind is very distracted, and the minute we try to focus on just hearing a sound vibration over and over again, the mind immediately drags us off to something else. And so this is the war, and this is actually the struggle with japa, is to bring the mind back from wherever and whenever it wanders due to its flickering and unsteady nature. We bring it back and we put it back on the sound vibration. And this is kind of like weightlifting, except you're doing it all in the mental plane. your mind is drifting away, and you're pulling it back, it's drifting away, you're pulling it back, you're drifting away, you're pulling it back. And in this way, we are learning about the inner world. You know, our society gives us a focus almost exclusively on the external world. That everything is out here. We look to the external world to find happiness. We look to the external world to find confirmation that we're doing the right thing. We look to the external world to find love. We look to the external world to find solace, to find relief, to find answers. But all those things can be found inside. And that's actually the best place to get them. But to reverse that tendency to look for everything on the outside, we have to gradually culture a rich internal life, which is very different from the way our society is oriented. We have to realize you're really bucking the current in a very serious way here. That don't expect people to understand what you're doing or why you're doing it. It won't make sense to most people. But the more you can be involved in chanting and praying, the more everything else will line up out here, outside, almost as if by magic, you know. It just works out that way. At least I've experienced that in my own life. But to work at having a deep internal life is a very, very important thing to do. And if you do that, you'll find this is the beads. There's 108 on here. There should be. If you get some from an Indian store, count them first. I don't know. I think I was chanting for a long time on a set of beads, and I realized there were 90 some on there. It wasn't 100. Oh my God! How long have I been doing that? You know? So count. Make sure there's 108 on there. You know, they're not made by machines somewhere in China. These are actually made by real people, and they make real mistakes. You know, so. These should have 108 on there, and you chant a full mantra on each bead: Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And then you do the same on the next bead. And then when you go all the way around from one end to the other, that's called a round, and that means you've chanted 108 times. So 2 rounds means you've chanted 216 times, you know. And time-wise, it should take you somewhere between 7.5 minutes and 10 minutes to go all the way around, one round. If it's taking longer than that, then you should speed up. If it's taking less than that, maybe you should slow down. You know, so that gives you kind of a ballpark. And of course, as you're chanting, you're going to immediately come into contact with something that most of us don't think about very much, and that is our mind. Now, we call it our mind, but actually most of us discover very soon in the process of Bhakti Yoga that our mind isn't ours at all. That seems to have a mind of its own. Our mind has a mind of its own. And it's planning to do things the way it's planning to do them, which sometimes doesn't have anything at all to do with the way we plan to do them. And that sounds funny, but it's real. And what happens is, through the process of chanting, our mind becomes more and more under our control, and we begin to realize, hey, that's crazy. I've been listening to this thing for many years. It's telling me what to do, and I'm sure this is me, but it isn't me. What is it? It's our past habits talking to us. It's stuff that we have programmed in there for not only this lifetime, but previous lifetimes too. Things our parents have put there, things our government puts there, things our society puts there, things that are put there by right and left, every kind of thing. That is our mind, and we take it serious. But when you're chanting and you kind of don't take it serious for some time while you're chanting, then when you hear it again, you think, wait a minute, maybe this thing isn't telling me the right thing. Maybe it's crazy. Maybe I shouldn't be listening to this thing. And you begin to take your own mind with a grain of salt, which is sort of the beginning of wisdom. You begin to realize that not everything that comes through the, circuits up here is something that's worthy and wonderful and will take us to higher ground. And chanting helps us to become aware that we are trying to control the mind. One of the themes of chapter 6 is also the mind. We learned that it's our best friend. It can be our worst enemy. That was earlier in this chapter. We talked about that it's our best friend or our worst enemy. Later in this chapter, after we get past verse 32 and 33 or 34, Arjuna says, I think the mind is impossible to overcome. It's like the raging wind. How can I overcome the raging wind? If you try to stop the mind, how can you stop it? So Krishna says, no, it is possible. And he says, how? By constant practice and detachment. So we get back to the idea of mental weightlifting again, of realizing when the mind has gone off the deep end and bringing it back to where it should be, chanting, and also recognizing, how the mind wanders, and that it's not always wandering to something that's a good thing. Oftentimes it wanders to bad places. And when we recognize our mind has wandered off to some not such wonderful place, we just bring it back. And that constant practice develops an inner life. And when you develop your inner life, then everything else begins to fall into place out here. Yeah.
I have one more thing I want to do.
Yeah.
When there's like negative energy, like I have a roommate and who literally thinks I'm crazy. But, I have pictures on the wall of Ganesh, Vishnu, Shiva, all around. And the other day he was on the phone saying, this guy really, really prays the elephants. So, I heard him talking one before I came in, and I just stood by the door. But he like literally hates the smell of incense. He hates the bell. It's like there's not one good thing he likes about what I do.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to like really not create a bad friction. Like I'm gonna chant more because he doesn't like it. So
Right.
I'm trying to set a mold. Like I'm trying to do it when he's not there.
Yeah.
Because like he'll come in and he's like, God, man, we're in India now.
Yeah.
And he'll slam the door. And I really don't want to lose it because then I'm gonna throw my blessings. Like I'm trying hard not to get upset. So like basically I'm just doing it when he's not there. But I feel like there's the bad energy. Like he'll hear me and he'll start throwing stuff. He'll put the radio on. He'll start talking loud to his girlfriend. And they say that the mantra actually alleviates any negative energy around. So sometimes he just leaves when I start.
Yeah.
Like he'll leave and he'll say like, how long are you gonna be, man? I know you're doing your thing, but and I wouldn't even answer. I just keep on.
Yeah.
So
That's difficult. He's your roommate, right?
It's kind of rough.
I mean, these kind of things are typical. It's not like this is something that's never happened. Oftentimes we find and we discover it. In this chapter and also in the second chapter, it says that what is night for all beings is the time of awakening for the introspective sage. What is day for all beings is night for the introspective sage. We're kind of like, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. You've got somebody walking on the ceiling and the other guy walking on the floor, and they're looking at each other and saying, you're upside down. It's the perspective, Prabhupada one time early in the movement wrote this little flyer he called, Who is Crazy? They say we are crazy, and we say they are crazy. So, to someone who thinks material happiness, money, and all kinds of facility are the real goal of life, what we're doing is completely crazy. But to someone who thinks spiritual life is there, and the endless, mindless chase after money and position in this world is crazy, then we say they're crazy. So, it's a question of perspective. And usually if you are just kind of humble about what you're doing and you just try to do it not in a in your face kind of a way, but this is what I'm doing, this is my life, you may understand it, okay, but I have to do it, this is what I feel is important to me, and sometimes people eventually mellow out and sometimes they don't, you can't predict. And since I guess you're in this kind of a tight situation with somebody, it's hard to predict which way that'll go. But my prayers are with you. I certain things that Krishna manifests. However, he can manifest anything they do, but then he manifests some things they do not manifest. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
I think it's amazing, if I can even remember the figure, but that Krishna was incarnated 5,000 years ago. And his next incarnation, because Krishna is 8,600,000,000 years. Isn't that amazing?
Krishna comes in his original form only once in a day of Brahma. So, Kali Yuga is 432,000 years long. And there are 4 yugas, but Dwapara Yuga is twice as long as Kali Yuga. Treta Yuga is 3 times as long as Kali Yuga. And Sat Yuga is 4 times as long as Kali Yuga. So that means all 4 yugas taken together are 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, which is 10. So an entire Divya Yuga, or all 4 yugas together, is then 4,320,000 years long. So that's 1 Divya Yuga. And there are 1,000 Divya Yugas in 1 day of Brahma, and also 1,000 in Brahma's night. So 2,000 times 4,320,000 gives you 8,640,000,000 years. So Krishna comes one time.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
I mean, he was just here, in other words.
Right.
5,000
So we just missed him by a measly 5,000 years.
a few seconds or so.
Yeah.
What is Narayana?
Narayan is a Vishnu expansion. He has 4 arms.
Yeah.
And he comes from Krishna. First, Krishna expands into Balaram, and I was telling her, then as Balaram, he expands into something called the Chaturvyuha. The Chaturvyuha are the aides de camp, that Prabhupada calls them. They protect the spiritual world, and they all have 4 arms. Krishna only has 2, but they have 4 arms. And then they expand into Narayan, and Narayan expands into another one of them, another Chaturvyuha, and it's kind of like one expansion leads to another expansion, leads to another expansion. But the thing to take away from this, without getting too technical, is that Krishna is the source of other incarnations, and Krishna comes in many forms and in many kinds of moods. So, as Lord Ramachandra, he comes in a greenish form. He has 2 arms. He appears in Treta Yuga. He has only 1 wife, and in that form, as Ramachandra, he fights a battle against Ravana and overcomes Ravana and wins his wife back, and that's Ramachandra's pastime. He also comes as Parasuram. He comes as Kurma, as the tortoise incarnation. He comes as Matsya, the fish incarnation. He comes in many, many different forms, and he comes in many different time periods. In fact, he's always coming in one time period or another, but for Kali Yuga, this time period we're in now, he's already come as Lord Chaitanya. He's existing today, though, in the form of his holy name, and that's the Maha Mantra that we were just talking about.
So we're gonna try to put the Maha Mantra to practice.
Oh, okay. Wait a minute, I think he had one question in the back. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's just like, yeah, just like we have, you know, spring, then summer, then fall, then winter. After winter, there's another spring, and it's the same thing with the yugas. They just recycle over and over again. And then there's larger cycles on top of those cycles, so, you know, it gets into really vast time periods. Okay, so we're kind of...
Can I ask one question?
Okay, maybe, unless...
Huh?
Unless...
How,
No, go ahead, no.
Okay.
how can I be harmony within myself? You know,
Uh-huh.
because in my life, you know, right now is so much. It's like people attacking me, you know. But
Uh-huh.
I want to I know that I have to manifest within me to be harmony with myself in order to harmony with my environment. So how can I do that first, you know?
You pray to Krishna and chant to Krishna. If you continue to do that, you develop an internal life, you know, a very rich internal life by praying to Krishna, by chanting Krishna's name. You'll find that you will be in harmony. People will see it. You will be in harmony. You will be able to really do good to other people if you do
Oh,
that. Yeah.
Just by chanting.
Just by chanting
And
praying and engaging the mind always in Krishna, which is what we've been talking about today. So we're gonna, I'm sorry I have to kind of cut it off because we're